Happy Holy Hump Day on this January 18th, everyone. I'm Pastor Robert, and welcome to this midweek time where I can share some spiritual thoughts and reflections with you. I love history.
Please refer to your history text.
No way! History? I love history! Something happens, then later something else happens. So sequential. Thank you, first guy, for writing history down.
And I love church history. And so I thought today would be a good day to just reflect on all of the pastors who have served our congregation since it started back in 1800. So we have a 223-year history as a congregation, which is amazing. And I just thought it would be nice to be able to highlight the many pastors that have served the church over the course of this long period of time. I love to go to our archives room here at our church. I always learn something new about our church's history. And so I went ahead and found a chart that had all of the names of the pastors that have served this congregation over these many years. And so that's a span of 223 years. So here's some interesting historical information about the pastors that have served this congregation over the many years. We have had a total of 86 senior pastors, 86 senior pastors. And we've had a total of 14 associate pastors. And actually, associate pastors, I believe, was more of a modern thing to have. There have been times in our church's history, like in the 1800s, where you'll often see two pastors at the same time. And I guess those two were sharing the duties of being the pastor during that time. So we do have several of those pairing of pastors in our church's history. So if you look at the senior pastors and the 223 years, that averages out to 2.6 years was the average length of a senior pastor's stay here. So this June, I will have completed my 8th year here as the senior pastor. And so I feel very fortunate and blessed to be able to serve that long compared to the 2.6 average over the course of our history. And I do think early in our Methodist history, that was common to have shorter pastorates, and they did move around a lot more. And then it became more beneficial, I guess, to have longer pastorates. Hopefully, if that was a good match, you tend to have longer pastorates. So I do feel blessed and thankful to have been your pastor for 8 years. And not every pastor can say that. So here's some highlights of our church's history related to pastors that have served our church. The founding pastor in 1800 was Reverend James Quinn. So a shout out to Reverend James Quinn for being the founding pastor. And we've had 4 church buildings in our church's long history. So when James Quinn came here, he would have been meeting in people's homes to have these smaller class meetings, they were called then. And then it wasn't until 1815 that our church got its first church building, and that was located on South Congress Street here in Athens. And there were 2 pastors that were there at the time when we had our first church building in 1815, Reverend Marcus Lindsay and Reverend Joseph Powell. So a shout out to those 2 pastors for helping us to have our first church building. And then our second church building was in 1837, and that was actually here around our present site that we have our current day building. So that was in 1837, and the 2 pastors at the time were Reverend John Stewart and Reverend Myle Dustin. And then our third church building, again here around our present site, was built in 1908, and that pastor was W.L. Slutes. And I just want to offer an extra shout out to Reverend Slutes back in 1908 because he worked very hard at the fundraiser to help there be this new building in 1908. And he didn't live long enough to be able to see or worship in the new building. And so just thankful for his dedication and sacrifice that he made on behalf of our church at that time. And then the fourth building, which is our current building, was built in 1957. And John Versteeg was the pastor at the time. And again, a shout out to John Versteeg, because in 1955, that 1908 building burnt down. There was a fire. And so that was on a Saturday morning. And somehow Reverend John Versteeg was able to connect with the university and to be able to have worship that very next Sunday morning at the university. And he has this wonderful sermon that he gave that next day to help start the healing process and to provide a sermon of hope as he was seeking to help the congregation at that time to know that there would be this strategy to have another church building, which is our current building now. So a shout out to John Versteeg for going through that very difficult time in 1955, 1956, and 1957. So your 87th senior pastor will be announced sometime this winter or early spring. So please keep our leadership board, the bishop, and the cabinet in your prayers during this time of discernment. So our leadership board has prayerfully submitted a church profile to help in the selection of your next senior pastor. I always think of my good friend, Reverend Dan Kiger, who served here at Athens First from 1984 to 1993. He has shared this with me several times, and I always appreciate what his quote is. He says, "We as pastors stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before us." And that is so true. It's not about, one pastor. It's about the history of pastors, because we all build on the work of the previous pastor. And you end up having this wonderful history of pastoral leadership. And so it is humbling to think about that we all depend on each other as pastoral leaders. And really, each pastor brings their own unique gifts, personalities, and skills, and strengths, and passions, and leadership styles. And I think that's very helpful in the course of the church's history. So I do invite you to join us for worship this Sunday at either 9 o'clock or 10:30, or you can watch the live stream of our 10:30 service on our church's YouTube channel. The worship theme will be Called to Follow, based on our appointed gospel reading where Jesus calls the disciples to follow him. What does it mean to say yes to Jesus and be one of his disciples? And speaking of this worship theme, it's not all about the pastor of a church. It's really about everyone in the church who are responding to Jesus' call to follow Jesus and seek to be one of Jesus' disciples. This is what it means to be God's faithful people. It's the pastor and the congregation working together. So may God bless you on this Holy Hump Day.